Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Thomas, and I'm an Energy Assistance Program Specialist from the Operations Branch of the Office of Community Services Division of Energy Assistance. On behalf of OCS, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, providing a step-by-step introduction to the fiscal year 2018 LIHEAP Performance Data Forms first module, Module 1, the Grantee Survey. Today's webinar will have two presenters, Melissa Torgerson of Verve Associates and Dan Bausch of Apprise. Today's webinar has three purposes. First, the webinar will provide an introduction to Module 1 of the Performance Data Form, otherwise known as the Grantee Survey. All state grantees are required to complete the Grantee Survey each year as part of the federal LIHEAP reporting requirements, and the webinar will discuss how this related to other required reports. Second, this webinar will provide an in-depth overview of the Grantee Survey, reviewing each item that you need to report line by line and the steps to report accurately according to the instructions. Finally, the webinar will highlight key things to remember and keep in mind to avoid common reporting issues. The audience for this webinar is new LIHEAP coordinators and staff who have not worked on the Grantee Survey, as well as coordinators and staff that would like to review the requirements in detail to understand all of the instructions and avoid reporting issues. Today's webinar is the first of 4 different webinars that we are offering on completing the 2018 Performance Data Form. Today's webinar is one of 2 that provide a comprehensive review of all of the reporting items in the Performance Data Form. The other comprehensive webinar on the Performance Measures modules will take place on January the 3rd. If you're already familiar with the Performance Data Form and the instructions, the final 2 reminder webinars planned for January the 10th and January the 23rd will provide a brief 30-minute review of the requirements and nuances. These webinars are intended for experienced LIHEAP coordinators and staff who want just a quick refresher on the main items to keep in mind. Our hope is that all of these training opportunities are helpful to you, and we thank you for your time and for joining us today.
Good morning or afternoon to all of you. I'm glad you could all be here today. During the webinar, we're going to spend about 90 minutes reviewing key information. The slides are available for download, and you can do that now. If you look at your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll notice that there is a handout PDF there, and so those are the slides we'll be reviewing right now, and you're welcome to download that at any time if you'd like to follow along. The webinar is being recorded today, and it will be published on the ACF YouTube channel. We have a few different ways for you to ask questions throughout the webinar. So as we're going along, if you have a question, we encourage you to type them in the GoToWebinar Question Box, and we'll show you where that is in a second. When you do submit a question, Apprise will go ahead and review that, and we'll go ahead and respond at the break, or if it's a question that's really more about your state and may not impact other states, we'll email you a response. And you can also click the raise your hand button during the breaks to be called on to ask a question over the phone. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see kind of where these control panels are. You'll see that there is a question spot, and you can type a question at any time. And then you can also expand the sidebar if you don't already have it expanded to see that question box. And you'll notice that there's a little hand there. So if you want to raise your hand during a break or question period, then you're welcome to do so.
Okay, we're going to start off with some basics of the LIHEAP Performance Data Form.
Okay, so for those of you who've been around a while, you know that the part of the performance measure form that we're going over, or performance data form that we're going over today, is the Grantee Survey. And this is an annual report that all state grantees in the District of Columbia must submit. The whole form consists of 3 modules. So the Grantee Survey, Module 2, which is LIHEAP performance measures, and Module 3, which is optional performance measures. for those of you who have been around a while, we've been submitting the Grantee Survey since the 1980s. The performance measures data in modules 2 and 3 was first required for the 2016 reporting cycle. Data that you submit in this form are published in the LIHEAP report to Congress. They're also published in the LIHEAP data warehouse, and there's a hyperlink here in the PDF. So all of your data from the past, Dan, what is it? Is it it's over 10 years, I think now, is in the data warehouse, and you can go back and take a look at it. The data is also used to respond to congressional and White House inquiries, which is why we spend so much time in these webinars going over how to do this accurately so that we're giving accurate information to people who request it.
So there are three main types of data that get reported in the LIHEAP performance data form. In Module 1, the Grantee Survey that we're going to focus in on today, the focus of that module is really fiscal information related to the sources of LIHEAP funding and the uses of LIHEAP funding during the federal fiscal year. The other two modules, modules 2 and 3, are focused on performance information that gets at the impacts of LIHEAP on your recipient's energy burden and LIHEAP's impact in helping households to maintain or restore energy service. Module 1 and Module 2 are both required for all state grantees to complete, and Module 3 is optional and voluntary. So the 2018 LIHEAP performance data form is going to be due in OLDC by January 30th of 2019. And here's an update on the status. As I just mentioned, it's going to be due on January 30th. OCS is expected to issue an action transmittal with the official instructions. But right now, you can access the 2018 form in the online data collection system, OLDC. And OCS has uploaded data to pre-populate the sources of funds fields. We're going to talk about that more later on. And you are encouraged to prepare your data in preparation for submitting your reports by that January due date. So what has changed from last year? Good news is that there are no changes to the 2018 performance data form from last year's 2017 performance data form. So there are no new data elements you're being asked to report. We included on this link a hyperlink to last year's instructions. And we also encourage you, as you prepare your current reports, to look back at any emails or communications about your report from last year or from earlier this year to see if there are any issues that you should keep in mind as you prepare your data. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how the Module 1 Grantee Survey data relates to other reports that you submit. So we're going to use 2018 here as an example. So before federal fiscal year 2018 began, your HHS asked you to submit a LIHEAP model plan. That model plan tells HHS what program components you're intending to operate and how you're going to carry out each of the LIHEAP assurances. And that's due in September each year, so about a month before a new fiscal year begins. Then during federal fiscal year 2018, there were two reports that you were asked to submit. The carryover and reallotment report is generally in the summer, and in that report you indicate to HHS if you're intending to carry over any of your funds for obligation in the next fiscal year, or if you intend to return any unobligated funds for reallotment. And then as part of your application for LIHEAP funds for the next fiscal year, you submit a preliminary household report, and that just has estimated data on how many households you've served so far during the fiscal year. Next slide. Okay, now that fiscal year 2018 is over, you're asked to submit a few different reports. First, there's the final household report. That's where you give HHS information on the count of households you served during 2018 with each different type of assistance. Standard Form 425, which is a fiscal financial report. And then you're asked to submit the performance data form. And in Module 1, you're telling HHS about your sources of funds, your uses of LIHEAP funds, average benefit amounts provided. And then Module 2, you're providing information about the energy burden of assisted households during 2018 and the number of occurrences where LIHEAP maintained a restored home energy service. So here's an example of how all these reports relate and can provide a comprehensive picture of your program activities. On this slide, this example is for heating assistance. So the model plan would be where you would say, in federal fiscal year 2018, we're going to provide heating assistance. We intend to allocate a certain percentage of funds to heating assistance. Then the Grantee Survey, you're looking back at what happened during the fiscal year, and you're reporting, here's how much in funds we obligated to heating assistance. Here's the average benefit we provided to each household. Here is the income dollar cutoff amount to be income eligible for heating assistance. And then the household report, you're reporting how many households got assistance with those funds, how many applied for heating assistance during the fiscal year. And then in the performance measures form, you're getting at the impacts, how much LIHEAP assistance reduced burden, the number of households that lost service and were restored or would have lost service and had that prevented. So this slide is just useful to see how all the different pieces connect and why different reports are required. Now we're going to go over some reporting rules for the Grantee Survey.
Okay, so Module 1, the Grantee Survey is designed to obtain fiscal data. So some of you are going to be working with your fiscal staff to do this. And it's really a lot like, I say this every year, a little bit like a checkbook. You're looking at the money that's coming into your program during FY 2018. So what is all the money that you got from OCS to administer LIHEAP in 2018? How you used it. And uses is a tricky word here because we're really talking about obligations and not expenditures, and we'll continue to say that throughout this webinar and explain that more and more. But basically we want to say, if you got $1 million in, how did you take that $1 million and split it up among all your program components? Average household benefits, we're looking at the average benefit amount you provided for each type of assistance during the year. And then we're also looking for maximum income cutoff. So what is the threshold you use to determine if a household was income eligible for each type of assistance? Just some basic, kind of ABC rules. You are expected to report data according to the official instructions, so I encourage you to take a look at those. A lot of you have unique program features or nuances. We just talked to someone on Monday who runs on a different program year, from the federal fiscal year. And so there are some nuances in the way that they're going to be reporting their data, and these need to be explained in the notes section. Provide a consistent report where total sources of funds equals total uses of funds. When that doesn't happen, we'll be doing a lot of follow-up with you to find out why. And so it's really important that, just like your checkbook, if $1 million is missing, that's not okay. So it's the same with this report. And we expect, or OCS expects, that you would investigate and address issues or questions from the review of your report in a timely fashion. And the prize and your liaisons are here to help you do that. And we are happy to get in the weeds even with you and figure out why things aren't matching up. So we say this in every webinar, and it really is important. LIHEAP is a block grant. It gives you a lot of freedom. We know you have unique and diverse programs, and these reports, though, are meant to give a consistent picture across all states, and so that's tricky. And so because we're asking to report kind of uniform statistics, we understand that not all of your program features, the way you run your program, are going to fit exactly into the fields that you've been given. And so what we encourage you to do, just, we say this over and over again, is review the instructions, follow the instructions, and when you encounter a challenge, when something isn't going to look right in the form, or you're not quite sure where something goes because it's not explained in the instructions, we encourage you to contact your OCS liaison or contact us directly.
And here's a few examples of instances when we want to make sure that you're aware of the instructions and are able to follow them. In the first bullet, a grantee may have a fiscal tracking system that's designed to report on when benefits are paid out or expended. However, for the grantee survey, you're being asked to report on the obligation of funds, even if those funds weren't expended yet. We're going to talk more about that. The second example is one Melissa just mentioned, which is if you operate your program on a different fiscal year than the federal fiscal year from October 1st to September 30th, you're still instructed to report information in the grantee survey that corresponds to the activities for the federal fiscal year.
So we say this kind of repetitively, but we do have an extensive notes section which allows you to explain any reporting information that's out of the ordinary or that generates a warning in OLDC or requires clarification. And this is really important because not only does it give us an accurate understanding when we think we're seeing an error, but we actually use your notes in the report to Congress so that when your representative or your legislators look at the data and see that it might be different from what they're seeing in the other states, or there's something, kind of that calls something into question, any notes that you include in your grantee survey will actually be transferred over to that report to Congress for clarification. And as you all know, that can be the difference between some alarming phone calls and none. So it's important that you put whatever notes you need to in that notes section in order to clarify what you're including in your report.
All right, here are two examples of that. First, one item you report in the grantee survey is the amount of funds that you obligated for weatherization assistance. And your grantee survey might show that that dollar amount is greater than 15%, which is the statutory limit for the amount of funds that can go to weatherization. However, you may know that you received a waiver from HHS that allows you to use up to 25% of funds for weatherization. So for the grantee survey, it's very helpful to include a note that indicates you had a waiver to exceed 15% for weatherization. And then the second example is there are automated warning messages that will appear in OLDC based on some validation checks the system performs on your form. And a grantee might receive one saying that in your household report, you said there were 0 households that received cooling assistance, but in your grantee survey, you reported funds as being obligated for cooling assistance. And that would be a situation where you'd want to include a note to explain that. For instance, the underlined example here is that you obligated funds for cooling assistance, but you're not going to expend those until the next fiscal year. Any situation like that would be important to have a note on.
So the grantee survey requires you to report using the best information you have available at the time of reporting. It's not an audit report. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. To meet the reporting requirements, we really encourage you to use your data reporting system. And in this case, too, your any fiscal data systems that you may have in place, identify and count funds for each LIHEAP component. You should be able to account for the amount of funds received by source and the amount of funds obligated for each category of use. And one of the things that we've helped a few grantees with is we understand that there can be challenges when you have fiscal doing one thing and you're focused on program operations. And so we've helped a lot of program staff work closely with their fiscal staff to come up with shared reports, so that at any time a program staff can go in and look at these particular figures to see how much has been obligated in each program area. So if you need help putting those kinds of shared reports together, or even translating ones that might already be in place if you're new, R.E.A.Ch is willing to help you with that. So we provide data validations and checks to assist grantees with reporting. For those of you who have been working on your household report, you may have already, or have in the past, have already seen some of these. And OLDC, as Dan mentioned, does a couple of a few automated validations, and they'll give you warning and error messages. You know, and some will keep you from moving forward, and others will just kind of tip you off that you either need to add a note or double check your figures. But beyond that, when R.E.A.Ch sees your reports, they do additional validations and reviews to make sure that the numbers are consistent and that things are being reported accurately across all of your reports. One key check is that the sum of the amounts reported in Section 3, estimated sources, is equal to the sum of the amounts reported in Section 4, estimated uses. And so, you know, that's what we talked about. This report is really, that's what's at the heart of this report. This much money came in, and this is how we have blocked it out across all of our program components. We ask that you report funding amounts rounded to the nearest whole dollar to avoid OLDC warning messages triggered an error to decimal or cent issues.
So the fourth reporting rule is it's expected that you'll be able to look into and investigate any issues or questions from your report. So after your report is submitted and gets reviewed, there may be some questions, and they're just intended to help you to confirm the accuracy of each item in your report. So you should be able to go back and look in your records or look at the information that's in your report to be able to verify items and identify any issues that need to be corrected. Okay, now we're going to dive into the Grantee Survey, and we're going to start off with the sources of LIHEAP funds, which is Section 3 of Module 1.
So this is where we collect and report data on the sources of funding available to your state in FY 2018. And so sources will include all federal funds designated for LIHEAP for your state, net of any set-asides to Indian tribes or tribal organizations. It'll also include prior year unobligated funds that were obligated in federal year 2018, and we're going to explain that a little bit more. What it should not include are federal funds designated for LIHEAP in prior fiscal years that has already been obligated, funds that were dedicated as set-asides to Indian tribes and tribal organizations, and non-federal funds, so leveraged state funds like fuel funds or utility ratepayer funds. We want sources of funds available during the federal fiscal year. So that's October 1 to 2017 through September 30th, 2018. We understand that many of you operate your programs on a different program year, starting in January or July. But what we're focused on is the money that came into your program during FY 2018, which is those particular dates. And so we understand that expenditures are going to be a little different for you, and the way you track funds are different, but we're looking for funds that were awarded for FY 2018.
When you go into OLDC to initiate your performance data form, you'll see that some fields have data populated into them already. So to assist grantees, OCS pre-populates several of the fields in this section, the Sources of Funds section. All grantees will have lines 1 and 3 pre-populated with non-zero values, and we're going to go over each line and talk about what each of those lines are. And then if you have carried over funds from fiscal year 2017 into fiscal year 2018, line 6 will also have a non-zero value that's pre-populated. OCS allows some of these fields to be editable. so that you can change a value, and some of them are locked and not editable. In this case, lines 1 and 3 are not editable, but line 6 is editable, and you can go in and make updates as needed. So even though OCS does pre-populate these values for you, it's still your responsibility as you're completing your grantee survey to verify that they are correct and match your own program records, and to reach out to your liaison and OCS if there's any issues with the amounts in your form. There are a handful of grantees that initiated their form in OLDC early, and the pre-populated data wasn't yet in place. So you should have received an email recently from Julia at R.E.A.Ch about the process to reinitiate your form so those values get pre-populated correctly. So if you fall into that category, the instructions are here, and you can always reach out to Julia and us at R.E.A.Ch if you need assistance. Okay, now we're going to look more in depth at Section 3 and look at each line. This is the view in OLDC that you see. And as you can see, there's a number of different potential sources of funds that we will discuss. So the first part is Part A, which is all funds except leveraging incentive awards.
Okay, so the first is where you're going to see most of the funding for your state, the first line, and this is the state's 2018 block grant allotment. And once again, it's net of any set-asides to Indian tribes and tribal organizations. So those funds will actually be on the tribes, in their tribe's own reporting. The block grant allotment funds are the primary LIHEAP funds provided to each grantee, and this field is pre-populated and locked from editing. I cannot underscore this enough. We've had several times in the past where grantees have gone through and spent hours biting their nails trying to figure out why their uses aren't matching up with their sources, and then at the end they go back to their sources and realize there was something wrong, there was a digit off. Before you even start looking at your uses, review your sources and make sure it's correct with your fiscal staff. If it's not, get on the phone with OCS in these uneditable fields, including this field, and make sure you get it right. It'll save you a lot of time in the long run. The next line, line 2, is Emergency Contingency Funds. This line contains the state's LIHEAP Emergency Contingency Funds, once again, net any set-asides to Indian tribes. For those of you who are new to the program, emergency contingency funds are issued when there are additional home energy assistance needs of one or more states arising from a natural disaster or other emergency. It's pre-populated by OCS and it's locked from editing. In most years, you should compare the amount against your fiscal records, but for 2018, the amount in this field should be 0 for all states. So if you've got your highlighter out and your slides out, highlight that. There shouldn't be a 0 in that box for all of you. Reallotted funds. These are funds that are released during the fiscal year after determining prior year funds that are available for redistribution. For some states, they have to send back money. HHS gathers all these funds up and then reallots them to states. This is another pre-populated field from OCS and is locked from editing. And before you even get started, you should work with your fiscal staff to make sure that the number in line 3 matches what you have in your fiscal records. And this is unobligated emergency contingency funds from the previous year. Sometimes what will happen is emergency contingency funds will come out late in the year, and HHS will allow you to not obligate a portion of them. And so that's what would go in this box. But once again, get your highlighters up because this number should be 0 for all of you for 2018.
So line 6 is where you report funds that came from the prior fiscal year and were carried over into fiscal year 2018 for obligation. So we will be talking about carryover funds in depth when we get to the uses of funds section. But in short, the LIHEAP statute allows states to hold up to 10% of funds payable to the state for fiscal year for obligation in the following fiscal year. As I mentioned earlier, if you did carry over funds from 2017 into fiscal year 2018, this field will be pre-populated with the amount that you reported. And if necessary, if you realize that amount needs to be updated, you can go in and edit the amount in line 6 to be correct. Okay, so the amount in line 6 should not include funds that were obligated in fiscal year 2017. So you would not be reporting any funds that were expended in 2018 but were still obligated in 2017. This should just be funds that were not obligated in fiscal year 2017 and were carried over to the next year. And the amount in this line should be equal to what you reported in the 2017 Grantee Survey under the uses of funds, as well as your 2017 carryover and reallotment report. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see an example of how these connect. So back in fiscal year 2017, each state fills out their carryover and reallotment report and reports the amount they intend to carry over to fiscal year 2018. Then months later, you complete your grantee survey, and you also put that carryover amount and make any corrections that are needed. And then that information is used to pre-populate this field in this year's sources of funds. And here's an example where a state has about $4.3 million that they're carrying over, and so you can see that amount reported in all three reports. So if you have any questions about this, we're going to be going over it more under uses of funds, and this is something that Melissa and I are happy to speak more about.
Yeah, and I would go back to that and just say, remember, it's kind of like a checkbook. And I don't know how many of you have actually balanced a checkbook by hand recently, but you know, at the end of every month, you're encouraged to say, what's my balance at the end of the month that I'm carrying over into the next month? And it's a lot like that. You know, the carryover and reallotment report in the 2017 Grantee Survey that are on the left side of your screen are that month end number, right? We have this much left in our account that we haven't obligated to something, and so we're carrying it into 2018, and that'll be a source of funds now that we can use in 2018. And so, you know, this isn't, there are a lot of words here that we use and a lot of terms that can make it complicated, but if you think of it just in that very basic way, at the end of the year, I haven't obligated this much, it's going to be available as a use now in the next year. It becomes a little bit easier to get your head around. So Dan gave me all the exciting lines here at the end that are like all zeros. So Petroleum violation escrow funds, for those of you who are new, you know, there are funds that come from petroleum violation. We have some examples here in terms of Exxon, other funds, and so these are considered to be federal LIHEAP funds once designated by a state LIHEAP grantee for LIHEAP. Line 7 is the only field that is not pre-populated, but in 2018 we expect it to be zero for all states. The R.E.A.Ch program is also going to be zero for all states, but for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is the Residential Energy Assistance Challenge program, and occasionally these funds are made available by HHS to kind of pilot programs that minimize the health and safety risks to high burden households, and it's pre-populated by OCS when states are awarded these funds and locked from editing. But once again, in 2018, no one received these funds, and so that it should be a zero for all of you. The second part, Part B, is the leveraging incentive award. And once again, Dan gave me the exciting field. It's zero, but many of you are new. In the past, leveraging incentive awards have been given out by HHS as a financial reward for states that go out and work hard to leverage additional funds for energy assistance. And that has not been done in the last few years. When it is done, it's pre-populated and locked from editing, but all of you should have a 0 in that field for FY 2018. And this is leveraging incentive award carried over from the previous fiscal year. So I've already explained what that leverage incentive award. One of the conditions is that you can carry some of that, or you can carry that money over into the next year. It's pre-populated by OCS and can be edited by grantees. But in 2018, because we didn't have any leveraging incentive awards awarded in 2017, this number should be 0 for all states. And we're going to move on next to Part C. So this is estimated total sources of funds.
Okay. So Part C, or line 11, is an automatic field that OLDC calculates for you. And all it's doing is it's adding up the amounts of the prior lines to give a total estimate of sources of funds. So this line is important because it's going to be used to compare your sources to your total uses later. And it's a line that you can easily see and use to check against your own records about how much in total funds, total 2018 funds you had available. And just hitting back on what Melissa was saying previously, there's really only one line that you need to be concerned about in the sources of funds, and that's line 6, the carryover line. Line 1 gets pre-populated for you. Line 3 gets pre-populated for you. Those should be checked and verified. But the other lines that Melissa reviewed this year are all going to be 0. Okay, so the total sources of funds should be equal to the estimated total uses of funds in Section 4 that we're going to review soon. The only exception here is if a grantee needs to return unobligated funds to the federal government that are in excess of the allowable amount for carryover, which is 10%. We're going to pause here and see if there are any questions that we can take. Before we continue, we are going to have another question break later on. I did see a question about the pre-population issue. If you have questions about how to make sure that your pre-population is correct, you can reach out to us directly and we'll be able to help verify that for you. Okay, it looks like we don't have any other pressing questions right now, so we will move back onto the webinar and address questions at the next break. So now we're going to move on to Section 4, which is the estimated uses of LIHEAP funds.
Okay, so we went over sources, which is all the money that you have available to obligate in FY 2018. And now we're going to go through and tell OCS and the world how you chose to obligate those funds. And so uses of funds should include all funds and awards that were obligated for use in LIHEAP during the federal fiscal year 2018. And we have the dates here again. As Dan mentioned, this includes funds that were carried over from 2017 but obligated in 2018. It should include funds obligated in 2018, even if they're expended later in 2019. The term obligation here, especially for new folks, is one that can be tricky. Obligation is as each state defines it. So for many states, an obligation would include money that's been awarded or contracted out to subgrantees or IT contractors or anything that's tied up in a contract or an agreement. Some of you may have different parameters. It's very important to talk to your fiscal staff about how you've defined obligated versus expended. But we're talking here about obligations. So in some cases, obligated funds are not actually expended until after the end of the fiscal year. Uses of funds should not include funds that were not obligated by the end of 2018 and will be returned to OCS. Some of you, because of the way your program is structured, you may not have subgrantees, and so for you, obligations are expenditures in many cases, and if you don't expend it all or get it obligated in another way, you have to return funds over that 10% carryover limit to OCS, and so those would not be in your form, and that's why when Dan said your sources and uses may not equal up, this would be the main reason for that. Funds that were obligated in 2017, even if they were expended during 2018. So, the household report and the performance data form look at assisted households, regardless of the funds used to assist those households during FY 2018. The Grantee Survey is different because we're really looking at the funds that were obligated regardless of when they were spent. And so if you had obligated funds that you actually spent during 2018, those would not be counted in this form. So the reporting period, once again, this is very important for those of you who may have a different program year or program contract year than the federal fiscal year, which is October 1st, 2017 to September 30th, 2018. Any data used to complete the uses of funds section should be data focused on the funds awarded during the federal fiscal year period.
So in Section 4, you're reporting how you used funds. And in your household report, you report on households that received assistance, so received the benefits of those funds. So Section 4 of your grantee survey should have information that's also consistent with your 2018 household report. Here's an example. If you reported assisting households with a type of assistance, for example, cooling assistance, so you have households as receiving cooling assistance in your household report, then you should be able to report 3 items that we're going to review. The first is the total amount in funds that you obligated for that assistance. The second is the average household benefit, so the average amount a household received. And finally, the maximum annual dollar income amount for a household to be eligible to receive that assistance. If you do not report information for a type of assistance that is reported in your household report, you should add a note that explains why you aren't reporting any funds for that type of assistance. An example might be that you are not reporting funds because you're using prior year funds that you obligated, but you're now expending that you expended later during fiscal year 2018. If you obligated funding to a type of assistance for which you did not report assisting any households, that would be another scenario in which you would add a note explaining why there's funds reported in your grantee survey, but there are 0 households that receive the assistance. Now we're going to look at Part A, which are the types of LIHEAP assistance. Okay, this is another visual of what this looks like in OLDC.
Okay. Can we actually, Julia, can we go back 3 slides, please? Sorry. I want to just expand on what Dan said here. For those of you who are new, and we'll talk about this again, I think, but I just want to underscore it. These reports aren't perfect. And so, when we talk about the grantee survey and sources and uses, we're talking about the funding that was awarded or that you carried into 2018 and how you obligated it. But we're also saying we're not talking about expenditures. And so it's tricky when we go in. Can you go one more slide back? When you start to get into this data about the total funds and award funds that were actually spent versus obligated, and the average household benefit in particular, when you get into that average household benefit, it gets tricky because you're talking about funds that could have been obligated in 2017. And so I can't underscore this enough that this is kind of a mishmash of data, and we expect to see lots of notes because many of you may be carrying funds into the year, or you may be spending prior year funds in order to help households. So if your head starts to get a little bit fuzzy in some of these areas, or things just aren't matching up to you, give us a call and we'll help walk you through it step by step, because this form isn't perfect. It kind of expects you to have your brain in 10 different places, and we're here to help you with that. So I'm sorry, we can go ahead. I know we'll hit on that again, but I can't underscore that piece enough. So total funds and awards. So this is heating assistance, and heating assistance benefits include funds allocated for regular heating assistance to pay a share of the household's heating bills. It also includes funds for other non-crisis heating assistance, such as furnace repairs or replacements done on a non-emergency basis. And not a lot of states do this, but there are some. And so if your heating assistance includes those kinds of non-bill payment assistance, we would like you to include a note that describes it and the amount of funds you used for that. Oh, I'm sorry. In all of these, and we'll say it in each slide, you should always exclude the cost of administration of these components, and admin goes in a completely different category. So we'll say that on each of these slides just as a reminder. So this is one of my favorite slides. Some of you, states like Washington and New Mexico and others, don't have a separate crisis component in their program. So in other words, some states will offer a household both a regular benefit as well as a crisis benefit. But states like New Mexico and Washington offer one benefit, and if it's a crisis benefit, it's expedited. And so grantees who are in this situation, who just have the one benefit and it's expedited or non-expedited, have two options when reporting the funds. You can report all funding obligated to assist households with heating assistance, both regular and expedited under heating assistance, or you can report funding obligated to assist households with regular heating assistance under heating, and the funding to obligated to assist households with expedited under crisis. If you are going to include them all in heating, you need to add a note indicating that some households received expedited heating assistance, so that we can say that you actually did provide crisis. I will say this, after working with states who are in this situation, think carefully about how you do this. When you go into the data warehouse and you want to pull your data, is it important for you to see how many households received expedited services? And if it is, it may be very worth your while to include those in the crisis line, because that will separate those households out in your data. Otherwise, you're going to have to kind of extrapolate from this bigger chunk of households how many got crisis assistance.
Right under heating assistance is line 2 for cooling assistance benefits. So cooling assistance benefits generally include funds that are allocated to help pay for a share of a household's cooling bills during the cooling season, and funds for other non-crisis cooling assistance, such as air conditioner installations done on a non-emergency basis. If you have a situation where part of your cooling assistance funds are used for non-emergency equipment, such as air conditioner installations, that's a situation where you should include a note to indicate that. And as Melissa said, we'll keep putting this reminder bullet here to exclude the cost of administering that component.
So crisis assistance is defined in the statute as assistance that's provided no later than 48 hours or 18 hours in life-threatening situations after a request for assistance. And you set your own criteria for crisis assistance, and it's in your model plan. And crisis reporting in the household report should be consistent with the model plan. In the Grantee Survey, benefits can be reported under 4 different categories. And when we say benefits, we mean obligation toward crisis assistance benefits. And this would be winter crisis, summer crisis, year-round crisis, or other crisis. And so you'll notice here, this is a screenshot of what something might look like. And we'll kind of walk through this here. So winter crisis benefits are any funds obligated to delivering winter crisis assistance to households, and it typically includes crisis assistance provided under the same timeline as the heating assistance program. And then, we've already talked about guidance on reporting funds for expedited or fast-track heating assistance, but those will be shown again on 89. As Dan said, we're going to exclude the cost of administration of the crisis assistance component. And examples of winter crisis could include bill payment after disconnection or disconnect notice, or emergency fuel delivery after running out of fuel or due to imminent risk of running out of fuel. So those are just examples. Each state is allowed to define what crisis is. So these are just 2 common examples that we see. Summer crisis benefits are any funds obligated to delivering summer crisis assistance, and in most states that kind of aligns with a cooling assistance program or the timeline, whether it be summer or in hot weather states it may be spring even. Exclude the cost of administration. Examples of summer crisis could include bill payment assistance after disconnection or disconnect notice. So year-round crisis benefits, funds obligated to delivering year-round crisis assistance to households. It typically includes crisis assistance provided throughout the year rather than seasonally. And so we already talked about fast-track heating assistance. I think it's important here to highlight that some of you may choose, states have defined this very differently in the past. So some of you have very clear summer emergency programs or crisis programs and winter crisis programs, and some of you have more, have kind of a broader definition of crisis, and so you offer year-round. It doesn't matter when they come in. And it's really up to you to kind of decide what you'd like to do. But once again, keep in mind that you want to be able to use the data that you're generating. And so I'm just going to throw out the example of Arizona. For a long time, they counted their crisis under year-round, but what they were missing when they went to report to their legislators was the importance of summer crisis, that need for cooling assistance in emergencies. And so they opted to look more closely at defining their crisis and their summer or heating and cooling year. And so that may be something that you want to consider, and a prize and your liaison can help you kind of walk through that. Year-round crisis could include bill payment assistance after disconnection or disconnect, and emergency fuel delivery after running out of fuel or due to imminent risk of running out of fuel. So line D is composed of 4 rows. So this is where we get into other crisis benefits, and many of you have these. So it's important to be thinking about this. The first row is not editable, so it's going to be auto-calculated based on lines 1, 2, and 3, as you can see in this slide. This is funding obligated to other crisis assistance, and in this example, you see furnace repair and furnace restart delineated. Some people may not have that. I think there's some examples on the next slide. So these are funds obligated to delivering other crisis assistance to households. These are things beyond what you define as winter, summer, year-round crisis. So this is where you should be putting emergency furnace repairs and replacements. It should have its own line. Administration does not belong in this line, but some examples of other crisis assistance, and we've seen all kinds. Space heaters, blankets, or other in-kind assistance. We've seen there's more than one state that does hotel vouchers for people that need it, payment of reconnection fees, deposit, all kinds of stuff. So once again, this is important to think about your data and how you want to be able to see the way you've obligated your funds over time and how that changes. And so give some thought to how you would break this out, also paying attention to how it's already broken out in your fiscal system. If you do obligate funds to another crisis program component, we'd like you to briefly describe the component where you'll be reporting the amount. So, you know, some of you have weird names. I'm just going to, it's not even weird, but some of the acronyms. So, for example, in West Virginia, I think you have the HEAP program, so heating equipment emergency repair, you know, something like that. And so don't use acronyms here, spell it out: emergency furnace repair and replacement. If the legislator sees this, it's going to be very important for them to see what it is actually and not have to translate an acronym. If you provide more than one kind of crisis assistance, report the funding obligated to the different kinds in the different rows.
You know, one other thing to keep in mind with crisis reporting is that flexibility that Melissa talked about. Along with that, you may have seen a lot of this guidance in past webinars on the household report. So you want to make sure as you're completing your grantee survey that if you determine your crisis program is a winter crisis program, then there should be households reported for winter crisis in the household report and funds reported in the grantee survey for winter crisis. We shouldn't see winter crisis household in the household report, but then households under year-round crisis assistance in the grantee survey, for example. Okay, line 4 is weatherization benefits, and this is where you'd indicate the amount of funds that you obligated for low-cost residential weatherization and other energy-related home repairs, if you have any. For this component, you'd include any weatherization funds for non-crisis assistance, and you should also add a note that describes that assistance. It's very, very important that you report LIHEAP funds only for line 4. We know that that some of you have have agencies that operate both LIHEAP and the Department of Energy's weatherization program, but the grantee survey is all about reporting on your uses of LIHEAP funds. So you should only report LIHEAP weatherization funds in line 4. Okay, as you may know, the LIHEAP statute limits the amount of LIHEAP funds that can be used for low-cost weatherization to 15% of LIHEAP funds, but HHS may grant a waiver that can raise that limit to 25%. And if that's the case for your state, you should include a note in the notes section of the grantee survey to indicate you received that waiver. There are several other uses of LIHEAP funds that similarly have a percentage limit to them. And you'll see the term funds payable, and you'll also see the term funds allocated in the instructions. And for fiscal year 2018, those terms are referring to the same thing. They're defined as the sum of your regular LIHEAP block grant allotment and your reallotted funds. So now we're going to move on to the second column that has the red border around it. That's the average household benefits. So for each type of assistance that we just went over, heating and cooling and crisis and weatherization, you're asked to indicate the average benefit amount for households that are assisted. For each type of assistance, the average benefit should take into account all the types of benefits that you provide under that type of assistance during the entire fiscal year. And that should be something that you calculate from your data system, from your data records, by summing up the benefit amounts across the households that received that assistance, and then dividing by the total number of households that received that assistance. Now, the average household benefit should include all the benefits that fit under that type of assistance. In most cases, heating assistance or cooling assistance is a regular benefit that goes to help pay a share of energy expenses. But if there's any other types of benefits besides bill payment assistance, we ask you to please include a description in the notes about that so we can understand that your average benefit might be a little high for that reason. And if you need any help in calculating the average benefit, you can reach out to us for assistance.
So Dan, to clarify, can we go back to Julia to the previous slide? To clarify, when I talked earlier about kind of using different pieces of information to compile this report, when a grantee goes in to sum the benefits across all households and divide by the total number of households that receive the assistance, we're talking here about actual expenditures. We're not asking them to take the obligated amount that they put in the column 1. We're talking about going into your data system, figuring out how much was expended on those households and dividing it by the number of people that got it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So the total amount is total obligated in that first column, and the second amount, the average benefit amount, is the average of the expenditures.
Right. So this is the one place in the report where we are asking you to look at your actual expenditures. And so that's an important distinction to make. I also want to go back to one more thing. I think it's really important. I'm sorry, Julia, can you go back actually 2 slides, I think? When we talk about weatherization, I know there's a lot of new coordinators on the phone, or on this call. Weatherization, some of you do heating or furnace repair and replacement as part of your crisis component. Some of you do additional furnace repair and replacement under your weatherization program. And so that's the reason why we have it in the crisis line. So some of you are thinking, oh my gosh, well, we do furnace repair and replacement under weatherization. Does that go under crisis or does that go under weatherization? Well, if it's done as part of your weatherization funding, that 15%, it goes under weatherization. Some of you may have additional furnace repair and replacement being done under crisis, which would go under your crisis assistance percentage. So I just want to clarify that, and if you need help distinguishing that in your grantee survey, give us a call, but it is important. We get that question a lot. Okay, so if we go back ahead, here we're talking about maximum annual dollar income, and so in the third column, we're really talking about eligibility thresholds. So what is the dollar income cutoff for a 4-person household that was in effect at the beginning of the federal fiscal year, October 1st, 2017. And so for this year, the poverty guidelines that were in effect at the beginning of FY 2018 were the 2017 HHS poverty guidelines. If a grantee's LIHEAP program component, say cooling, began after the release of the 2018 guidelines, the grantee may choose to use the 2018 guidelines in its FY 2018 grantee survey reporting. And you should just include a note. So I know there are some states, I think Virginia in the past has noted this, where they use the they would have used the 2017 for their heating assistance, which begins in the fall and winter. But by the time they start their cooling assistance program in the summer, they have 2018 poverty guidelines. And so for the cooling assistance program, they're actually using a different income eligibility threshold. And that's okay. It's just very important that you note that in the notes section. We also know that in some states, the way that certain groups of households or vulnerable households, for example, might be prioritized is by using a higher dollar amount income cutoff for elderly, and a lower dollar income cutoff for everyone else. And so what we'd like you to do in these situations, if you are using different thresholds for different groups of people, is to report the lower of the 2 income cutoffs. And we also would like you to put this in the notes section, what the higher income cutoff is, and to the specific group where it applies.
Okay, line 5 is average annual total LIHEAP benefit per household. This is an interesting line because it it is actually information that you generate and calculate as part of Module 2, the performance measures. What this line is intended to report is the average amount in bill payment benefits that households received if you collected their energy bill data for Module 2. You can see it's broken out there by the main heating fuel: electricity, natural gas, oil, propane, or other. So we recommend that for this line you calculate the information for Module 2, and then you go back and put this information in line 5 of Module 1. One thing to just stress if you're newer is that last year for the performance data form for fiscal year 2017, the process was a little unusual because approval for the form needed to be renewed. So there were some delays, but this year Module 1 and Module 2 are both going to be due at the same time, and it's expected that you'll have information in this line that's the same as line B1 in Section 5. So this is just some additional information about how to calculate those averages. Bill payment assistance is a concept we talked about in the recent household report webinars, and that's really any benefit that goes to pay a share of household energy bills. So regular heating assistance, regular cooling assistance, or crisis assistance, but it wouldn't include non-bill payment assistance, which is things like repair and replacement of equipment, weatherization, or any nominal payments that you make to SNAP households. In some states, you may provide benefits to households more than once for the same type of assistance or across different types of assistance. And so if a household received a regular heating benefit and a crisis benefit as bill payment assistance, when you calculate these averages, you want to make sure that you add up the value of both the heating assistance and the crisis benefit together and assign that value as the total amount a household got. And there's an example in the last bullet here. The Smith household got a $50 crisis assistance benefit, and they got a $200 heating assistance benefit. You would add those two up, and the total amount the Smith household got is $250, and that would be used in calculating the average amount across multiple households. Now we're going to move on to Part B, which is other permitted uses of LIHEAP funds.
So nominal payments, for those of you who may be doing the Heat and Eat or Cool and Eat program, this is what nominal payments, this line is for you. So this is the total funding obligated for these kinds of payments. There are things that deviate from the state's regular payment matrix because the household received only a minimal benefit as part of a partnership with the SNAP program. Only the few states that have this component should need to use this line. And if you have questions, you can go ahead and give us a call. Unobligated funds carried over to the next fiscal year. So this is what we were talking about in the checkbook. For 2018, if we were doing a checkbook and we're doing our year-end kind of balance remaining of things we have unobligated, this is what that would look like. So we're going to talk about the total funds. In this line, we're talking about the total funds carried over into the next fiscal year. So these are the funds that you're taking from last year and that you brought into this year that are unobligated, not unexpended. Many of you are going to have way more unexpended funds, right? These are funds that you didn't assign anywhere. They're not tied up in contracts. They're unobligated funds. And every state's allowed to pull over 10% of their allocation. Portion of funds payable, I'm going to use the correct terminology, to the state for fiscal year, from fiscal year 2018 into 19. To make it more clear, the statute requires that 90% of the funds payable, so remember that's your reallocated funds or reallotted funds as well as your main award, must be obligated in the fiscal year in which the funds were awarded. So 90% of the funds that you got in 2018 should be in the other uses, across the other pieces of this form as obligated. But you can take 10% as unobligated funds and carry it over into the next year. So if the amount of unobligated funds is greater than 10% of the funds payable, the excess funds must be returned to the federal government. So this is why, we talk a lot about refunds, and we talk about a lot about ways to avoid going over that 10%. Line 7 should only include funds carried over to 2018. If your state returned excess unobligated funds to the federal government, you should exclude these funds from line 7. So let's say that your state, you realize the end of 2018 that you actually didn't obligate 15% of your funds. And you know that you're going to keep 10% because you're allowed that, but you're going to have to return that 5% back to HHS. We do not want you to include that excess 5% that you're returning in line 7. You should exclude it. And what's going to happen now is when you do exclude that, you've got this 5% floating out there because there's really no place to put it in this report. And so what it's going to mean is that your estimated total uses and sources are going to be different. There will be a discrepancy. You can still submit the form, but you need to include a note that says we actually did not obligate. This is an example. We did not obligate 15%. We're going to carry over 10% of it, and the remaining 5% we're returning to the feds. Once again, this can kind of sound complicated and be tricky to get your head around, but give us a call if you're finding yourself in a situation. We'll help walk you through where to put things in different fields. So this is an example of where we talk about these reports lining up. The amount in uses of funds should align with your 2018 carryover report. So if you said in your 2018 carryover report, we're going to, we have a balance of $4 million in unobligated funds, or $4.3 million, and we should see that in your uses of funds in the 2018 Grantee Survey. Go back just one second, Julia. This is really important. And I guarantee that many of you will have this, I would circle it once again. If you've got a copy in front of you already, circle this bullet right here. If the amount in your 2018 carryover and reallotment is incorrect, you need to notify OCS and submit a revised report. I cannot say this enough. If Heather Jones is on the call, we always tell people that even though there's not a two-part system to reporting the carryover and reallotment, you should be doing it in a two-part way, because you don't turn in that carry and reallotment report at the end of your fiscal year. You turn it in August, or at the end of July or August. And so that's before your year is even over. It's before you've gotten all your refunds back, some of you. And that carryover may well have been adjusted since you've submitted that form. And so I would encourage all of you, before you even get started on the Grantee Survey, to go in and make sure that that carryover and reallotment report is correct, and that you've updated it with accurate numbers. And that will help you kind of avoid any validation or warnings or errors.
Line 8 is another example of a line that should be $0 for the 2018 report. This is for that concept Melissa explained earlier of emergency contingency funds that are being carried over into the next federal fiscal year, but it should be 0 for this year's report. Line 9 is to report leveraging incentive awards that will be obligated in the next federal fiscal year. This also should be $0 for this year's report. And then line 11 is where you report funds used for the identification, development, and demonstration of leverage incentive activities. So you would report here if you obligated any portion of your LIHEAP funds to help identify, develop, or demonstrate leveraging activities. Now, the LIHEAP statute limits this amount to the greater of 0.08% of funds payable, or $35,000.
So if you have any Assurance 16 activities, these are things that include services that encourage households to reduce their home energy needs and the need for energy assistance. For those of you who are new, this is a plethora of different kind of activities that you can do. The statute limits this amount to 5% of funds payable, and you would put the amount of these activities in line 12. If you find that some of your activities, you're not sure which fall under Assurance 16, or maybe you have some but you haven't defined it as Assurance 16 in the past and you think it belongs there, apprising your liaison can help you kind of walk through that.
Line 13 is for the R.E.A.Ch program, the Residential Energy Assistance Challenge program that Melissa described earlier. For 2018, for the report, the amount of this line should also be 0.
So we talked about administration and planning costs here we keep saying to exclude it, and now is its shining moment in line 14 is where you get to report this, and this should include all state and local administration and planning costs, and it should include both direct and indirect costs charged as administration and planning costs for the program. If you want to go on to the next line here, grantees have flexibility to define what counts as admin versus program costs. So there's a whole issue brief in the clearinghouse about this. It's very good. I recommend that you all take a look at it if you're kind of wondering how you could divvy this up, but your state should have it written somewhere what counts as admin and what counts as program. The cost of administration of the state's LIHEAP weatherization assistance should be included here. So it's very important that you're not popping the weatherization administration into that 15%, that you're actually including it in the 10% administration cap. This is one of the areas where the form isn't perfect. So there's not a separate field for program-related information technology expenditure. So for many states, part of their IT expenditures are program-related and part of them are administrative. And so what we have states do is put all of their IT costs in the admin line, and putting a note in your in the notes field that X amount is dedicated to program-related IT. We understand this may pop you up and over the 10% admin limit, and that's why that note is especially important, and it would be included in the reports to Congress. But for right now, that is our that's the way that we're asking you all to report it. All IT costs go in admin with a note specifying how much went to program-related IT costs. So once again, the statute limits the amounts that you obligate to planning and administration to 10%. And if a state obligated less than the allowed 10% to admin and planning in the previous fiscal year, the state may obligate funds received in the previous year and carried over to the current fiscal year to administration and planning costs. So once again, this is something to highlight. This might cause the amount reported here to be over the allowable 10% of funds payable. So what we're saying is that if you in 2017 didn't use all of your admin, you spent under 10%, and you have some room in your carryover amount, you can carry some of that over as admin. And it may bump you up and over the 10% for 2018. Once again, if for any reason you're up and over 10% or any of these caps, you need to have a note explaining why. And so this would be a note that just says we carried over administrative funds from 2017 into 2018. It's really important that you're tracking all of these. That 10% admin funds, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's still got to fit also within the carryover limit, correct?
Yes.
Right. So, you know, if I spent 8% of my admin funding, but I'm already carrying over my 10% as unobligated funds, I can't just add the 2% in to make it 12% carryover, you know, whatever. It needs to be, they all need to work together, and it can get confusing, but once again, we're here to help you walk through that if you need it.
Now we're going to move on to Part C, estimated total uses of funds. And we are close to finishing up, so thank you all for sticking in with us. Okay, line 15 is another example where the form will calculate this line for you. It's going to sum up all the prior lines in Section 4, uses of funds, and give you the total amount. This happens once you go to validate the form. And this is where that key check occurs to see if your total uses here that you report across heating and cooling and all the other lines we just reviewed matches the total sources of funds that you reported in Section 3. The only exception to this should be if you have a unique situation where there's unobligated funds that you're unable to carry over and need to return as reallotment funds. Okay, at the bottom of Module 1, there are two final questions. The first is question number 1, obligated funding for a given type of assistance in the current fiscal year, but will serve households in the subsequent fiscal year. This is a yes-no question, and it's meant to help provide information to explain why you may have funding for a given type of assistance, but in your household report are not showing households for that type of assistance because you're intending to use those funds to serve households in a subsequent fiscal year. So if you drop this down and select yes, you should have a note that explains it. Okay, the second question is asking you if any of the average household benefits that you report in that middle second column are estimated due to unique program operation rather than directly calculated. For the most part, you should be able to directly calculate these if you're using traditional bill payment assistance benefits. But if there are unique services that you're providing and some reason that you're unable to directly calculate those, you'd select yes here and then provide more information in the notes about that. Okay, we're going to move on to final reminders and then take some questions.
Okay, we're going to move these fairly fast, or through these very fast. Once again, this performance data form is due on January 30th. This includes the Module 1 that we've just gone over, as well as Module 2 performance measures. OCS is expected to publish an action transmittal soon with the instructions. Remember that the performance data form must be entered, saved, certified, and submitted in OLDC, and this can take some time, so be prepared and allow yourself for that time. And there are no changes to the FY 2018 performance data form. The requirements remain the same as those for last year's form.
OLDC includes several validation checks, and there are two types of messages you could receive when you go to validate your form. One's a warning message. That's just meant to alert you to a possible issue, to something you should investigate, and you may have to add a note on if the data are correct. And then a fatal error message would indicate if the data were inconsistent and you need to correct it before you can submit your form. If you receive any of those and you're not sure how to address it, just reach out to us for assistance, and we can look at your form and help you to understand what's occurring. Once you submit the report, Apprise will then review and conduct additional manual checks, and you'll receive emails about any issues or questions. It's expected you'll be able to provide a response and to work on any corrections. And then once your form is complete, your liaison will accept it in OLDC once it's been reviewed and deemed complete. And that information gets used in the LIHEAP report to Congress. And if you later need to go back and make an update, you can submit a revision in OLDC to have a record of that correction.
There are lots of resources for you to use. We've included several links, including the poverty guidelines for those maximum thresholds, the performance data form instructions from 2017. Remember, nothing's changed from 2017, so you can use this to get started. Past year's grantee survey data is helpful, and that's on the data warehouse. And the clearinghouse carryover reallotment tool is really awesome. I encourage you, for those of you who might be struggling with that concept, to use this tool to figure out what's carryover and what's reallotment. There is this very awesome resource out there, and we welcome your comments on it, but if you have a chance to take a look at it, this is a check before you submit document. It'll help you catch errors. It kind of walks you through the same system R.E.A.Ch uses to manually check your form. And so this will help you avoid a lot of resubmissions and fixing and revisions. And so I encourage you to take a look at this link. And also to review and address OLDC warning or error messages. If it pops up and you can explain it, leave a note. If you can't figure out why it's popping up, contact R.E.A.Ch. But those will be followed up on, so it makes sense for you to preemptively address them. These are OLDC resources. The only thing I would add to all of this and all of these links is that there is a how to use OLDC webinar out there. And if you need that, we can link you to that. It's on the ACF training page. And the other thing I always say is don't wait to log in if you haven't logged into the system for a while. Get in there now and get your login and your password and make sure it's all squared away, especially if you're someone who waits till the last minute to turn in your reports. Here are all the folks that are available to help you. The OCS liaisons are a great resource, especially in terms of figuring out what components you do and where things fit. The Grant Center of Excellence, this is your OLDC resource if you're having challenges getting into OLDC or entering things. And our entire R.E.A.Ch team, I don't know if you've met them all or have had the opportunity to talk with them, but they are phenomenal people. And you're welcome to get a hold of any of us, and if we can't answer your question, we'll give you to someone else on the team who can.
All right. We will take any questions. If you have any, you can type them in or raise your hand. Julie is going to let us know if anybody's raising their hand. We did have one question that came in, which is, where are we supposed to put outreach funds? Melissa's made the point a few times that the grantee survey form is not perfect and that each grantee has flexibility for reporting in different ways, and outreach is one of those examples where it can depend on your state and how if you characterize outreach as program costs or as administrative planning costs. So you have flexibility as to where to report those in either one of those bins. Is that your understanding as well, Melissa?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. We got another question. The main issue we have with filling out the grantee survey is that it's focused on 1 year's funds, but we spend funds over more than 1 year. So this makes it hard to separate out funds for the report. Are there any suggestions for how to approach this?
Yes, call us. I'm assuming Julia or Dan have the state name there, but if you're having issues tracking your award funding, it could be as simple as the way you're labeling that funding. And so we can give you some tips that we've seen from other states on how to effectively track award year funding, because we know that you're spending, I mean, some people are spending, remember that you have 5 years to spend the funds once they've been awarded, but you may obligate them in the first and second year. And so there are states who are using all different kinds of funds all throughout the different years, and we can help you learn to track, give you some different ways to do that. So we'll reach out to whoever that is and give them some tips.
We got a question about will we be emailing everyone the slides for people who came late. First, if you want the slides now, they're available under the handouts feature on the GoToWebinar bar that's probably on the right side of your screen. Each of these webinars also is recorded, and then they are posted on the LIHEAP training page and on the ACF YouTube channel. And we make the slides available on the LIHEAP Performance Management website. And we can also email them to you if you'd like them emailed to you. All right, I think that is it for questions and for our time today. So on behalf of all of us, we really thank you for your time, especially with the busy holiday season. And our next webinar will be taking place in early January, on January 3rd, and that'll be a similar in-depth review of Module 2, the performance measures portion of the form. So we hope to see you then. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.